Christians in civil government, but we're dealing with three spheres of authority. The Bible gives us three spheres of authority: family, church, and government. And so the most basic of the spheres of authority is the family. And so we're going to delve into that. We started a little bit last week. And so we get into it even further this evening, but we were looking at Ephesians chapter 5. And we'll read a few verses there to kind of help us jumpstart into the family this evening. And we'll look at verses 20 through 2, and we'll go through the end of the chapter. Because mainly we're going to start into marriage this evening, so I'm hoping we'll have good days today. All right, wives, submit yourselves unto your own husbands, as unto the Lord. For the husband is the head of the wife, even as Christ is the head of the church, and he is the Savior of the body. Therefore, as the church is subject unto Christ, so let the wives be to their own husbands in everything. Husbands, love your wives, even as Christ also loved the church and gave himself for it, that he might sanctify and cleanse it with washing of water by the word, that he might present it to himself a glorious church, not having spot or wrinkle or any such thing, but that it should be holy and without blemish. So ought men to love their wives as their own bodies. He that loveth his wife loveth himself. For no man ever yet hated his own flesh, but nourisheth and cherisheth it, even as the Lord the church. For we are members of his body, of his flesh, and of his bones. For this cause shall a man leave his father and mother, and shall be joined unto his wife, and they two shall be one flesh. This is a great mystery, but I speak concerning Christ and the church. Nevertheless, let every one of you in particular so love his wife, even as himself, and the wife see that she reverence her husbands. We had looked at it last week, how, let me find it. We talked about how the monastery during the Middle Ages was the center for Christian living. If you were to be an outstanding Christian, you would have to live a celibate life. You would have to live a life in celibacy and in solitary. You have the Reformation come along, and the church reaffirms and reestablishes the fact that the family is where you find godliness. Marriage and family replaced celibacy as the divinely ordained setting for a Christian life and salvation. And so as we look at some of these ideals that the Reformers brought to the picture and what the Puritans brought to us, they brought a few things to marriage that helped set the stage for how Christians look at marriage today. The first idea was that they understood marriage as companionship. The woman was made, as Matthew Henry says, talking about Genesis 2:22, the woman was made of a rib out of the side of Adam, not made out of his head to top him, nor out of his feet to be trampled upon him, but out of his side to be equal with him, under his arms to be protected, and near his heart to be beloved. They also understood within marriage that they esteemed sexual relations within marriage. With coming out of the Middle Ages, the dominant view about sexual relations was that sexuality was evil. It was wrong. And so if a man or a woman had a desire for sexual relations, they were considered evil. But when the Reformation happened, when we began to say that salvation was by faith alone, in Christ alone, to God's glory alone, it changed also the looks of marriage. And so they affirmed 1 Corinthians 7:3. Let the husband render unto the wife due benevolence, and likewise also the wife unto the husband. They elevated the task of child rearing and children. There is no power, Luther says, that is nobler or greater than that of parents. The greatest service that one can perform for humanity is to rear godly children. The greatest service that one could perform for humanity, our Christian forefathers would say, was to rear godly children. Marriage was the foundation and nucleus of society and the divine instrument for its stability and reform. Now, what we're experiencing today in our society is not anything new. The fact that we are seeing the degradation of the family, the degradation of society, is not anything new. But for us to understand and bring stability back to the family and to bring stability back to society is to bring back godliness into the marriage, bring back godliness into the family, and thus it will bring back godliness into society. For the family, you see, was, as the Reformers and the Puritans would say, was the first school of religion, the first school of society, and the first school of economy. Thomas Manton would say the family is the seminary of church and state, and if children be not well principled there, all miscarrieth. Well-ordered families, Cotton Mather, a New England Puritan, would say, well-ordered families naturally produce a good order in other societies. When families are under ill discipline, all other societies will be ill disciplined. Richard Baxter, writing in the 16th century, he says, that most of the mischiefs that now infest or seize upon mankind throughout the earth consist in or are caused by the disorders and ill governedness of families. Now, these are the schools and shops of Satan, from whence proceed the beastly ignorance, lust, and sensuality, the devilish pride, malignity, and cruelty against the holy ways of God, which have so unmanned the progeny of Adam. These are the nests in which the serpent doth hatch the eggs of covetousness, envy, strife, revenge, tyranny, disobedience, wars, bloodshed, and all the miseries by which they make the world calamitous. That was the 16th century, the 1500s, that Baxter was writing about the ills of the day, that the family was so ill-prepared for society that this is what was causing the issues in his society in the 1500s. As we delve into marriage this evening and in the next few weeks, marriage is one of the greatest outward blessings that in this world man enjoys. George Swinnock says this about marriage. He says, marriage is a fellowship of the nearest union and dearest communion in the world. And he warns, this is a warning, he says, consider a wife or a husband as the greatest outward comfort or cross in this world. A husband or a wife could be your greatest comfort or your greatest cross. Thy wife, he goes on to say, will be your best friend or your worst foe that godliness can have in thy family. And you could flip that on the other side. Your husband could be your best friend or your worst foe that godliness can have in that family. A healthy marriage is only possible if a Christian foundation is in place. There's a Spanish proverb that says, there is more required to marriage than 2 pair of legs and 1 pair of sheets. Short, sweet. For all of us who are married, we understand these things. For those of you single, can understand these things, right? The Spanish proverb is this: there's more required to marriage than 2 pair of legs and 1 pair of sheets. And for us as Christians, we need a godly foundation outside of the pair of sheets. See, God did not institute marriage to be a hindrance to the church. God did not institute marriage to be a hindrance to society. In fact, God instituted marriage to help society and help the church. But for whatever reason, in our day and age, it is looked down upon. The divorce rate is going down. That is a good thing. But so is the marriage rate. And it's much easier just to live together. because that way there's no commitment. If something goes bad, then you just walk out. So for the following reasons, then, we'll give you 4 of the following reasons, then, the religious, if you want to call it religious, if you want to call it spiritual, if you want to call it the biblical foundations of marriage are critical then. Are they not? Whether you've been newly married, whether you've been, Mark, how long you've been married?
It's 2008, so 12 years.
12 years. 12 years. Hannah, you're 15-ish years? 14. I'm 14. Kenny and Donna, we're just going to leave you plus 25 and be done with it.
More than double.
Yeah, well, we're just going to leave you at plus 25. We don't want to make you feel old this evening. Definitely don't want to make Dennis feel old this evening either. The first thing we need to understand is that marriage needs to be held in honor, right? There is something dignified about marriage. Hebrews 13:4. What does the Bible say? Hebrews 13:4. Marriage is honorable in all. And the bed undefiled, but whoremongers and adulterers God will judge. So not only is marriage, as when he would point out, that not only it is lawful and unblameable, but it's also noble and honorable. Right? Marriage can be these things. We as Christians need to understand that marriage is a beautiful, godly, glorious thing that God's given us. Because God is the author of marriage. And because He authored it, He approves it, and He's pleased by Christians marrying one another and having godly children. So the dignity of marriage is found in the fact that God is the author, that God has instituted it by divine decree back in Genesis 2. Now, we see that it is dignified in the fact that it was instituted before sin. Right? Genesis chapter 2 is, we see Adam, and then we see him fall asleep, and then God creates Eve out of Adam. Genesis chapter 3, sin enters into the world, so the marriage itself, the marriage union itself, is a beautiful thing even before sin entered into the world. And we use it to perform essential duties of marriage, and its purpose is, obviously, the chief end of man is to glorify God and enjoy Him forever. So we understand that that is the overall purpose of mankind, right? To glorify God and enjoy Him forever. But the purpose of marriage is not only to glorify God, but it's for companionship and reproduction. I mean, just think about it. For those of you who have been married longer than 25 plus years. For me, being married 14 years. Now, we could probably say couples have just a few years together. Right? I mean, you could remember, just like it was yesterday, that your marriage day, right? For some of you, it was just yesterday. But we can remember that, right? I mean, it was just, well, it feels just like yesterday. Just like you can look at any of your children that were born, it feels just like it was yesterday. But for some of us, it was 5, 10, 15, 20. We'll stop at 25 for Dennis's sake. But there is, in a way, just because life is a vapor, you could almost say that marriage is even less of one. Then should we not make the most of our time together in the little amount of time that we have? Should we not make the most of our time to encourage godliness in each other? Should this not be our central aim, that for God bringing both of us together, that we should try to build up one another in our sanctification processes, that God is going to use our spouse in our lives, for the rest of our lives, for however long that may be, for our sanctification? The Reformers and Puritans would use the phrase helpers of each obviously salvation used in that category is not how we look at salvation as being saved from our penalty of sin. The salvation is the furtherance along of our sanctification. But if you're going to help each other with godliness throughout your marriage, then that means that both of you have to be believers, right? And we can't marry an unbeliever and expect the unbeliever to help us in our sanctification. But two, we may take this a step further and say that both of us are committed to godliness, right? If you are in a marriage that either partner or spouse, husband or wife are not committed to godliness, then it's going to hamper your sanctification process. That does not mean that God cannot use the other for your sanctification, because we know that God can do those things. But your spouse will not be the conduit with which Christ uses it, her or him, in that sanctification process. We've mentioned something before. He talks to the husbands in his book, and he says, "Reader, art thou a husband?" He says, "Consider the fact that within a few days God will take away from you the delight of thine eyes." Within a few days, God is going to take your wife. He goes on to say, "Thy voice ere long will not be, where is my wife?" And he basically says you're going to have to call your mother, you're going to have to call your friend, your child, or whoever you have to call, and tell someone that your wife is dead. Something that we don't like to think about, especially in today's American society, where the big deal is to make sure you live as long and as healthy and as prosperous as we can. But we as Christians realize that we are born, right, to die. For the wages of sin is death. We all understand that we sin. We all understand that we die. So there is going to come a day in which we as husbands, if we outlive our spouse, we are going to have to say, we're going to have to understand that our wives will die. And wives, and we'll get into this in a moment, wives, your husband is going to die. And we're going to have to make the phone call, or you're going to have to make the phone call and talk to your child, talk to your friend. If your parents are still around, talk to your parents and say, my wife, my husband is dead. And he says, in that moment, and you begin to reflect on your marriage, what did you talk about? Did you encourage her to live for God? Or, in his words, often wrangled with her? Did you seldom or never pray together? Did you often talk about how you're going to increase, as he says, your temporal goods? He asked the question, are we going to look back on our marriage and talk about how we never furthered our everlasting good? And he says, if you do not think about your spiritual things, I'm paraphrasing him, he says, weep for her indeed and weep for yourself. Because he goes on to say, will she not, thinkest thou, and say to thee when she meets thee at that great day, as Zipporah did to Moses, a bloody husband hast thou been to me. Then he goes on and he exhorts the wives. at your husband. Consider the fact that the time that you spend together, whether it's on the couch, watching TV, whether it's in the car, going on vacation, sitting across the kitchen table talking. There's going to come a time that those things that you often embraced will hang down, meaning it will die. Then it won't be long for that body to crumble into dust. And he asks the wife, shall it be your business only to please him? To feed his flesh? Is it going to be your duty only to mind his carnal pleasure but never his spiritual life? Or will you rather get him to love and to do good works? Or persuade him to mind godliness, to pray with you? That we may live together as fellow heirs and at last meet together in the blessed inheritance. Marriage, just like life, is frail and brief. What are we going to do with marriage? Not only is marriage frail and brief, and we must hurry, there is quite a commitment in marriage. There is a covenant within marriage. Proverbs 2:17, which forsaketh the guide of her youth and forgetteth the covenant of her God. Have we as spouses not made promises that we are obligated to keep? Are we not all weak and frail and needy and wretched sinners that have to keep these promises? And for you, in order for you to keep these promises, the only way that strength comes from, because there are going to be times, and I'm sure many of us have had those times, that marriage is not all fun and games. And the only way you get through those times is because God's strength is allowing you to move forward in those times. So marriage is frail and it's brief. Marriage is also a covenant commitment. But there are also crosses that come with marriage. And God's grace is necessary for us to overcome those things within marriage. As one author says, the married condition is comfortable, but yet like the bee it hath its sting, as well as its honey. As the rose that hath many prickles, as well as some sweetness. As Paul says in 1 Corinthians 7:28, and if thou marry, thou hast not sinned, and if a virgin marry, she hath not sinned. Nevertheless, such shall have trouble in the flesh. But I spare you. One commentator goes on to say marriage is both honorable and honorable. One with an H and one without the H. So marriage is honor and honoree. If that makes sense. So it is not without aspersions. Because when you marry someone who has honor and is also honoree, obviously there are going to be times where you can ask my wife, my honoriness comes out. And I will tell you this, hers will come out as well. And because she's not here, it's more often that way. I'll probably get it. hurry, I must tell thee that it is godliness alone which can teach thee, as a bird in a hedge, to sing and be cheerful in the midst of those thorns and briars, those troubles which in this estate surround thee. And so we've looked at tonight, there is frailty and brevity to marriage. There is a covenant commitment to marriage, and there is